Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Professor Eugene Sadler-Smith, a distinguished expert in organizational behavior at Surrey Business School, University of Surrey. Professor Eugene's research dwells into the nuances of intuition in decision making and the concept of hubris in leadership. In this episode, he will share valuable insights from his latest book, The Hubris Hazard: How to Avoid It. Professor Eugene, it's a true delight to have you on the podcast, and we are eager to dive into the critical lessons you have to offer from your work.
Deepak, lovely to meet you, and thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a great pleasure, and I'm looking forward to it immensely.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, can you explain what hubris means in the context of leadership and decision making? And what are some of the common signs that a leader may be experiences hubris?
Yeah, of course. So, what is hubris and what are some of the common signs? Well, hubris has been around in human history for thousands of years. It goes way back to the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Greeks had a myth that warned against the dangers of hubris. Many people will know the myth, the story. It's the story of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun. Icarus and Daedalus, his father, were imprisoned on an island, and they would like to escape. And Daedalus was the master craftsman. He could make anything. So he made some wings, and he made the wings out of wax and feathers so that they could fly to their freedom. But before they took off on their journey to escape, Daedalus warned his son, Icarus, not to fly too high and not to fly too close to the sun. So they began their flight away, and Icarus, being young and impetuous, became overconfident with his power of flight. And of course, in ancient Greece, only the gods could have the power of flight. But here was a human with the power of flight. Icarus became intoxicated with the power of flight and with his success at flying. And he ignored the warning of his father not to fly too close to the sun, not to fly too high. Of course, what he did was he flew too high. He flew too close to the sun. The heat from the sun melted the wax that held the wings together. The wings disintegrated, and Icarus fell to his death as a result of two things: his intoxication with power and success, and also the fact that he ignored the warning that his father gave to him. So when I talk about hubris to audiences, to executives and students, I say to them, if you understand the story of Icarus and Daedalus, you've understood hubris, because that really captures the essence of it. That's what hubris is about. It's about this intoxication with power and the intoxication with success and ignoring warnings. So that then takes us on, I guess, to you asked, Deepak, what are the characteristics of hubris? I think there are four of them. First of all, hubristic leaders are overconfident. Second, they're proud of themselves, not of their achievements of the organization, but the pride comes from themselves rather than the achievement. So they're overconfident, they're proud, they're arrogant, and they're contemptuous. They ignore advice. So if we think about what are the four things: contemptuous, overconfident, arrogant, and proud. Those are the four characteristics of leaders, of a hubristic leader. The other thing to say about the Greeks, though, just to finish off this first point, is the Greeks invented the idea of hubris, and they called it hybris. So in English, we changed it to hubris. But the Greeks also had another idea that was closely connected to it. And the other idea that's closely connected to it is nemesis. And Nemesis in ancient Greece was the goddess of punishment. And she punished human beings for thinking that they were godlike. So in ancient Greece, hubris was usually followed by nemesis. So I think that's a great little story that helps to get the idea across. Not only does it describe what hubris is, it explains it as a warning against becoming too overconfident, contemptuous, arrogant and proud. So that for me is what hubris is all about, Deepak. I hope that helps.
Very insightful. Professor, how can hubris negatively impact decision making and the overall performance of an organization? Can you share any real world examples to illustrate this?
So yeah, hubris can have a as with Icarus, hubris had a very negative effect on him. He lost his life. But similarly, in business organizations, hubris can have very negative consequences. The research into this, and I know this is a research-based podcast series, that's why I think it's such a brilliant project. The research into hubris goes way back into the 1980s with a quantitative finance researcher called Richard Roll. And he came up with something called the hubris hypothesis back in the 1980s. And what Richard Roll discovered, and this finding has been replicated many, many times over the years, is that hubristic leaders in mergers and acquisitions overpay. They pay too much for the acquisition because they think they know better than the markets. So what happens is they inflate the value of the firm that they want to acquire. They pay too much for it. The resultant value of the merged firm is less. So it's their arrogance has actually cost the company money because they overpay for acquisitions. I think Richard Roll's work is foundational. It's really the first scientific study in business and management of hubris, and its findings that have been replicated many, many times since. Since then, of course, since the 1980s, there have been lots of examples of hubris in business and management with catastrophic and disastrous consequences. The one that sticks in everybody's mind, Deepak, is the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, where one of the criticisms that was made of the banks at the time was that, and these aren't my words, these are words from insiders in the industry, that one of the criticisms of the banks at the time was that there was a hubristic tone at the top of the organizations. In other words, the bosses of many of the big banks that got into really serious trouble and nearly brought economic disaster on the whole world economy. Many of the bosses at the top of the banks at that time exhibited those signs of hubris that we've already talked about. They were overconfident, they were arrogant, they were contemptuous of advice. One of the ones that stands out and is often used as an example is one of the first banks that went down in the financial crisis, which was Lehman Brothers in the US, under the leadership of its chief executive, Richard Fuld, who many people argue was a hubristic leader. I'm in the UK, so talking about the UK, there's a bank called the Royal Bank of Scotland, and that was criticised because it had hubristic leadership at the top of the organization. So that's way back in 2007, 2008. But Deepak, one of the things that's fascinating about hubris is it just doesn't seem to go away. It comes back time and time again. If we go back to 2023 and 2022, to 1 or 2 years ago, two really important and interesting examples of hubris in business are in the US. Elizabeth Holmes was the founder and the chief executive of Theranos, which was a blood testing company. Without going into the details of it, and in the Hubris Hazard book, I tell the story in depth. But basically, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty of defrauding investors and patients in that particular case. And she was sentenced to 11 years imprisonment by a US judge because her hubris caused her to be overconfident, arrogant, proud, contemptuous, which led to defrauding of investors. Found guilty, went to jail. And again, the most recent example is just last year with Sam Bankman-Fried, who was the founder and chief exec of a cryptocurrency company called FTX. And similar to Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, Sam Bankman-Fried, sometimes called SBF, was found guilty of defrauding investors and other felonies and he was sentenced by a US court to 25 years in jail. So hubris clearly can have really important and significant and catastrophic consequences for individual leaders. But not only that, it can have catastrophic consequences for followers, because of course there are no leaders without followers. So it can have catastrophic consequences on followers. It can have catastrophic consequences on customers, patients in the case of healthcare companies, investors, entire industries in the case of the financial crisis were affected. And in fact, if you think about go back to the financial crisis of 2008, not only did hubris, the hubris of the industry there affect the industry itself, it also affected national economies and the world economy. You know, and it took years for the world economy to recover from the effects of that. And hubris was a really important factor in the financial crisis. So the lesson we can take from that, I think, is, well, there are two lessons. The first one is that hubris doesn't go away. It's still around, and we still need to watch out for it really carefully. But the second thing is, for any leader, not just people like Sam Bankman-Fried, Elizabeth Holmes, Richard Fuld at Lehman Brothers, I think hubris is an occupational hazard for any leader. So leaders need to be aware of the hazard and do whatever they can to prevent it from causing them problems, their organization problems, and wider industry and society problems as well. Again, in the book, there are lots of other examples of leaders in business and in politics, because let's not forget about politics. In the book, there are lots of other stories and examples of business leaders and political leaders as well who fell foul, who fell prey to the hubris hazard, and it had serious consequences for them and everybody around them. So I hope that gives you some nice examples of the effects that it can have.
Yeah. Professor, you explored the concept of intuition in decision making. So how can leaders differentiate between healthy intuition and decision making that is driven by hubris?
All right. Yeah. It's a great point, Deepak. I'm glad you've linked the two things together, because my main interest, I've got two main research interests. One is hubris, which we're talking about today, and the Hubris Hazard book published earlier this year. My other main interest is intuition, which is, gut feeling. There are different words for it in common speak. So that's my other interest, is intuition. If you don't mind me saying, I've got a new book coming out. It's actually coming out this month, published by Pearson, called Trust Your Gut, available at all good bookstores and online retailers now. That's my other interest, is intuition. And Deepak, you've asked a really insightful question. What's the connection between them? I think intuition is a good thing for leaders to have and to use in moderation if they've got the necessary experience and expertise to back up their intuition. So intuition is a good thing if it's used in moderation and in the right circumstances. However, I think if intuition is used in the wrong circumstances, and if it's used to excess, then it can become a problem. So I think when intuition is overused and it spirals out of control, that's when intuition can become a problem for leaders, and it can lead to hubris, because intuition can lead you to overconfidence. And then if we think, okay, well, how can we counter that? So intuition exists in kind of a yin-yang relationship with analysis or rationality. So there's on the one hand, and it's nothing to do with left brain and right brain necessarily. So if you think, on the one hand, we've got intuition. On the other hand, we've got rationality or analysis. Well, in a kind of a healthy cognitive economy, if you want to call it that, then there's a balance between intuition and analysis. And we need both. We need both intuition and analysis. But what can happen when leaders become hubristic, when they become overconfident, arrogant, and proud? Their intuition can crowd out analysis. So it pushes analysis out of the picture. They become less analytical. They become less rational. They become more driven by gut feeling, by instinct, and that can often be a bad thing, especially in uncertain, volatile, complex, ambiguous situations. In the book, the story that I tell of that, where intuition crowds out analysis, is the case of the former US President George W. Bush in his invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it's well documented in the accounts of that episode in US foreign policy that George W. Bush trusted his instincts and his intuitions. And people argue that he put too much faith in his intuition and too much faith in his instincts. And that led him to overestimate the probability of a successful outcome in Iraq. And it led him to underestimate the chances of a negative outcome in Iraq. And of course, what we know, as we know what happened subsequently, people have said, political biographers have said about Bush's invasion of Iraq, this isn't me now, this is political biographers have said, political scientists have said, that it's possibly one of the worst US foreign policy decisions because of everything that followed from it with ISIS and everything through the Middle East. So that's the example that I talk about in the book of intuition, crowding out analysis. But it's not just George W. Bush and, presidents. We all need to be wary of the balance, of having this nice, healthy balance between intuition and analysis. If intuition takes over too much, that can lead us into being hubristic and becoming overconfident, and that then can lead to the negative consequences that we've spoken about. So thanks for that great question, Deepak. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Eugene. Professor, what strategies or practices can leaders adopt to avoid falling into the hubris hazard? Are there specific tools or framework you recommend?
Yeah. What strategies and practices that I use? I like to use analogies or metaphors. So if you think about a health metaphor, sunlight can cause skin cancer. Too much exposure to sunlight can result in bad consequences for the human body. So a good way to avoid that hazard, the hazard of sunlight, and reduce the risk of skin cancer is to avoid exposure to sunlight. So to wear sun cream, to stay indoors, to wear a sunshade, etc. I think the same thing applies to hubris. I think what we need to do is to identify the hubris risk factors. What are the risk factors in an organization that can cause hubris to happen? And then the strategy, you asked about strategy, Deepak. The strategy then has to be, how can we avoid exposure to it? A little bit like, how do we avoid exposure to the sun? So if we think about what are the risk factors, in fact, in the new book, in the Hubris Hazard, every chapter is about a particular risk factor. Chapter 1, the first risk factor in the book, is the biggest risk factor, and that's power. Because hubris, I think I may have mentioned earlier in connection with Icarus, hubris has been described as an intoxication with power. It's also an intoxication with success. So leaders become intoxicated with power and success. How can we avoid that? How can we avoid exposure to the power, to the hazard, the hubris hazard of power? I think what we need to do is have systems and procedures and processes and protocols in place in organizations that can constrain leader power. That means having boards of directors who are willing to challenge a leader. It means having non-executive directors who are willing to challenge the leader and put some restraints on the leader's exercising of power. So it's about having in an organization systems that can restrain the leader's power. Success is a risk factor. How can we protect against exposure to success? I think it's about leaders not thinking too big and showing a little bit of humility and attributing success not just to themselves but to other people. And we can, if we have time, we can say a little bit more about humility a little bit later on. And intuition is a risk factor. Well, we know. Let's balance intuition with analysis. Let's not get carried away. Let's not expose ourselves to too much intuition. Balance it with your analysis. The other thing that we've not spoken about, Deepak, and I think it's really important, is everything so far has been focused on the individual leader, the leader themselves, but there are no leaders without followers. You know, leadership, if we want to define leadership is a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So that says that leadership involves two things, as well as the leader. It involves followers and context. And I think followers can be a hazard, because if followers don't challenge the leader, if followers are simply opportunists who want to follow the leader, whatever, to cash in on the leader's success, that can create a problem. The other problem that followers can provide is if they're simply passive and don't challenge the leader. So I don't think we can look at the leader themselves without looking at the role that followers play in creating hubris or promoting hubris. Followers can be opportunistic, they can be passive. Either way, they can support the development of hubris in a bad way. And then, as well as the followers, there's the context. We can't ignore the context. And I think one of the things about context is unstable context, unstable situations can create the conditions for hubris. So, for example, political instability can create the conditions for hubris. Now, I'm not going to get into politics because, you know, that's a contentious issue. But if we look across the world in domestic politics, international politics, unstable situations create the conditions for hubris to come about. In business, unstable situations. Think about crypto. It's unknown territory. And in those unstable, uncertain, novel, new situations, where there aren't any rules, guidelines, checks and balances, that context can create the space for a hubristic leader to become hubristic. So to round off that point about strategies and practices that leaders can take to prevent it from happening. First off, it's about identifying the risk factors for the leader themselves. But it's also about identifying the risk factors from followers. Are your followers being too complicit? Are they simply echoing your views? Why aren't they challenging you? So there's the leader, there are followers, and then there's the context. What's the context like? Is it so uncertain and unstable that I shouldn't be taking too many risks? If we take those three things together, leader, followers, context, that creates something that's been referred to in the research literature, to go back to research, as the toxic triangle. So the toxic triangle of hubristic leadership, leader, followers, context, that can create what we could call a perfect storm. If you've got those three things together in the wrong combination, and we saw that in the financial crisis, we saw it in Theranos with Elizabeth Holmes, we saw it in FTX with Sam Bankman-Fried. All of those three ingredients were in place, and that created the perfect storm for hubris to happen. So it's about looking for risk factors, avoiding exposure to them, but also being aware of context and followers. So yeah, again, great question. Thank you for that one about strategies.
Thank you, Professor. How important is feedback in preventing hubris? And what systems can organizations implement to encourage open and honest feedback?
Yeah, feedback. Giving feedback to a chief executive officer or a president or a prime minister can be a difficult thing, Deepak, can't it? But I think this point about giving feedback to senior leaders is important, because it brings up an important point about senior leadership and being the boss. It's lonely. You're at the top of the pyramid, and that's quite a lonely place to be. So it can be difficult to get feedback from below. But the other thing that being at the top of the pyramid, that lonely place at the top of the mountain, another thing that makes that difficult is to do with benchmarking, because there's no one there to benchmark and compare yourself against. Everybody you compare and benchmark yourself to is below you. You're not benchmarking against your peer CEOs or prime ministers or presidents. You're looking down at people below you. So what point does this lead us to? I think it leads us to the point where leaders at the top of organizations, senior leaders, and that can be the CEO, but it can be the head of a department as well. It doesn't have to be the top person. I think they need to actively seek feedback on their performance, because any leadership position can be a lonely one. So, I mean, what kind of strategies and systems can be put in place for that? Anonymous feedback, 360-degree feedback, peer feedback, asking for honest feedback from a trusted confidant. In the literature, in the political literature, they've got a word for this, for the idea of having a trusted person to give you honest feedback on how you're doing. And they call it a toe holder, as in toe, as in foot. And the reason it's called a toe holder, and it comes from Franklin D. Roosevelt, US president back in the 1940s. And he had a toe holder, a trusted colleague, a trusted guy called Lewis Howe was the president's sidekick. And Lewis Howe's role was to be the toe holder for Franklin D. Roosevelt. And why he's called a toe holder it was so that they held onto the president's toe to stop him floating off and becoming too hubristic, pulling him back down to earth, pulling him back down by the toe to stop him flying too close to the sun. And I think the same thing can apply to chief execs and any leader, that I think all leaders need a toe holder. But who can that toe holder be? Well, it's going to be difficult if it's someone who reports to them to be the toe holder, to be the person that gives the leader open and honest feedback, which can be critical and often can be painful. So who else could fulfill that role? I think there are a number of clear candidates for people who can be toe holders for leaders. Coaches, for one, mentors, peers in a peer network of CEOs, partners, spouses, husbands, wives. They can be great toe holders that can help pull leaders back down to earth. So I think you've hit the nail on the head here, Deepak. A really important point is that feedback on the leader is really important in preventing hubris, because feedback helps a leader to self-reflect and have more self-awareness. And then out of self-awareness can come things like humility, for example, that can help to prevent hubris from taking place.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, if a leader realizes that they have acted with hubris, what steps can they take to rectify their decisions and restore trust within their team and organizations?
Yeah, I mean, trust is a big issue, isn't it? And it's one of the most vital issues in any kind of relationship. And leadership is about relationships, and trust is central to relationships. And as we all know, in our professional and our personal lives, trust takes a long time to build, but it can be lost in an instant. And once it's lost, some people say sometimes it might be impossible to rebuild it, or at least very difficult to rebuild it. So I think it's true to say that it's hard to build. It's even harder to repair, and I think to rebuild that trust is a long journey. But I think repairing the trust that might have been lost because a leader's been hubristic starts with the leader being open and honest about their failings, about what went wrong, and that can be difficult for leaders to do. To show that honesty and openness. But a good example of that, I think, recently is the former UK Prime Minister, Tony Blair. And just recently, I've just finished reading, actually. He's written a fantastic new book called On Leadership. It's about leadership in politics, but the lessons apply to leadership in business as well. And I think one of the things that stood out for me in Tony Blair's new book, and he's got a whole chapter in the book on hubris. One of the real standout things from it, one of the great strengths of it, is that he expressed an open and honest opinion about the things that he got right, but also an open and honest opinion about some of the things that he got wrong. And of course, one of the things that Tony Blair has been severely criticised for by his critics is the Iraq invasion. And in his new book on leadership, he comes clean and he admits some mistakes were made by him in assuming, in the case of the Iraq invasion, that the United States and the United Kingdom could go in there and change the regime. He thinks it's he described it as a fundamental misjudgment. He thinks that he and Bush made a fundamental misjudgment there, that they could go in and change Iraq, in a short period of time through the use of military force. So I think that's a really nice example of how a leader can come clean and be open and honest about the mistakes that they've made as a way to rebuild the trust that may have been lost. But as I say, it can be a difficult thing to do, and it's difficult to own up to our mistakes. But again, that comes back to this idea of self-awareness and leaders reflecting and becoming more self-aware. So I hope that helps with restoring trust, which, as you've highlighted trust, and I think it's really important in the leadership relationship.
Professor, what areas of hubris and leadership do you think need further research? Are there emerging trends or challenges in leadership that relate to hubris today?
Yeah. It's a great point. I mean, I started off by saying that hubris has been around for thousands of years, and it has. But as a subject in business research, it's not that old, actually. The earliest studies, as I mentioned earlier, were back in the 1980s, but that was mainly in quantitative finance. And it didn't really make any impact in kind of mainstream management. And by that, I mean leadership studies, management, organizational behavior, until maybe 10 years ago. So in that respect, it's a very young area of study. So it's a great area for people to get into if they want to kind of, get into a new and evolving and exciting and relevant area of research. So what are the kind of topics and trends that I think need to be looked at? I think the first thing to say is about measuring hubris. And we talked about CEOs and prime ministers and presidents, but the same thing applies to leaders at any kind of level, really. They're difficult to access. So it's not like measuring job satisfaction or organizational commitment or loyalty or stress or anything like that amongst employees. To measure hubris with a leader immediately presents you with access problems because they're hard to get at. Plus, because hubris is a negative thing, they may not want to be interviewed about it or to fill out a questionnaire about hubris. So we need to measure hubris. I think we need to find indirect measures to get at leaders' hubris. One of the most exciting and interesting ways of doing that, I think, is looking at the words that leaders use, their language, because the language and the words that people use can give an indication about their inner psychological state. And we've done some interesting work here 3 or 4 years ago now, published in journals like the Journal of Business Ethics, British Journal of Management, where we looked at what we've called linguistic markers of hubris. So it's the words that leaders use that indicate that they have hubris or they might develop hubris. So the words that leaders use can give it away in a sense. So words that are to do with power, obviously, words that are to do with reward, words that are to do with quantities, they're the kind of words that often can indicate hubris. Another interesting one, linguistic marker, is the use of the word we rather than I. Hubristic leaders tend to use the word we more than they use the word I. If people want to find out why, I'd be happy to tell them. You can read about it in the book, but if people want to get in touch with me there's no time to go into the details with the linguistic analyses here. But leaders who are hubristic tend to use the word we more than they use the word I. So that would be one area, measurement using indirect methods like linguistic markers. Another interesting area, of course, is bound to be artificial intelligence. And is AI a little bit of hubris on the part of humanity? Have we created this fantastic thing that might eventually kind of run out of control? Has our hubris got the better of us? We create this Frankenstein monster of AI that can escape, and we can't put it back into the bottle. So have we in our technology become too hubristic, too overconfident, too arrogant, too proud in our technological achievements? So that would be AI and hubris. And then the final thing to say, the third thing as far as research directions go, is everything I've said, Deepak, up until this point has been negative about the dark side. Hubris is a bad thing. It's part of the dark side of leadership. But actually, people are starting to say, maybe hubris has got a bright side. Maybe it's not all about the dark side of hubris. And if we think of an example of that, Steve Jobs. So people, he's changed the world. But many people argue that he was hubristic. And then we need to ask ourselves the question, would Steve Jobs have changed the world if he had not have been hubristic? So perhaps hubris has got a bright side. And if we look at Elon Musk as now, a living leader who's transforming the world, is he hubristic? But do leaders like that need to be hubristic to change the world in which they do? So those are three areas: measurement, hubris and AI, and the bright side of hubris are interesting new areas to research in this relatively new topic.
Professor, my last question. What are some key takeaways from the Hubris Hazard that you believe every leader should know?
Key takeaways from the Hubris Hazard. All right. Takeaway number one is that a hubris risk factors and you should avoid exposure to them, like the sunlight analogy I gave. Second takeaway is hubris is an occupational hazard for leaders. So every leader needs to be aware of it. Don't just think it affects certain types of people who are, naturally narcissistic or overconfident or arrogant. It can affect anybody. And the third takeaway, I think, is it's a quote, and it's a quote from Warren Buffett, founder, chairman, CEO, boss of Berkshire Hathaway, one of the most successful investment firms in the world and one of the world's richest people. Warren Buffett said that the best results come from a carefully calibrated balance of humility and hubris. So we need a touch of the bright side of hubris, but we need to be very, very aware of the dark side of hubris and cultivate or grow our humility in order to keep the darker side in balance. So it's about balancing that. The bright and the dark side of hubris would be my final takeaway, because, as I say, maybe we need a little bit of hubris if we're to achieve remarkable things. But going back to the ancient Greeks, again, we'll end with the ancient Greeks where we began. And the ancient Greeks said moderation in all things. And that means avoid excesses and deficiencies. And if there's a key takeaway, and not just in my book, but in the whole of the study of hubris, it's about this idea of this fine judgment between an excess of something and a deficiency of something. So too much confidence is a bad thing. Too little confidence is a bad thing. What a manager and a leader needs to do, and it's one of the most difficult things to do, is to judge how much confidence, for example, is the right amount of confidence. How much ambition is the right amount of ambition. How much courage is the right amount of courage. So that for me is this kind of fine balancing act of between excess and deficiency. And not going back to Icarus and Daedalus. Daedalus urged his son Icarus not to fly too high, not to show excess. But Deepak, he also urged him not to fly too low, not to show a deficiency. So there we are. We end with another fantastic lesson from the ancient Greeks about hubris and its perils.
Thank you, Professor Eugene Sadler-Smith, for sharing your valuable insights and research on this groundbreaking book. Professor Eugene, your insights on hubris and intuition, as shared from your book, The Hubris Hazard, How to Avoid It, have provided us valuable lessons to reflect on in our own leadership journeys. For our listeners, I encourage you to explore Professor Eugene's work further to better understand how to navigate the complexities of leadership and make informed decisions. Thank you once again, Professor Eugene, for your time and expertise. Until next time, this is Deepak signing off from Business Talk.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.